Hello, everyone. A warm welcome to you all from the team at Dependable Solutions. My name is Rhys Fleming. I'm Dependable Solutions Sales Director for Europe, and I'll be facilitating this morning's panel session on innovation and control. I'm joined by the magnificent Simon Gresswell, Managing Director at SGLP, an independent licensing consultancy and agent specializing in sports, lifestyle, and charity brands. Simon has over 25 years' experience in licensing, retail, merchandising, and we are thrilled to have him with us this morning. And bringing his own quarter-of-a-century experience in international trademark law is Julius Stobbs, founder of Stobbs Intangible Assets Management, a specialist consultancy bringing together commercial acumen and legal diligence. The previous head of trademarks at iPulse, Julius has lectured on the subject of international trademark law at Manchester University and served on a number of committees. And I hear that he can get around 9 holes of golf pretty quickly too. Gentlemen, good morning.
Hi there.
So Simon, if I could start with you. The year 2020 has been a tough one for everyone. Can you tell me a little bit about the activity that you've seen with sports brands and how they've really adapted to this year?
Yeah. Thanks, Rhys. Yeah, I mean, tough is an understatement, I guess. No sport, and then sport behind closed doors, and no fans, and obviously no retail throughout. So pretty catastrophic for the sports industry, but in particular also the licensing, merchandising side of that. I think you've seen a lot of adaptability and creativity just in the way you've seen in media broadcast, and how quickly sports federations and their broadcasters adapted and put crowd noise in an atmosphere to the behind closed doors broadcasts. You've seen it kind of mirrored in consumer products as well. Maybe not on such a high tech level, but take a great example out of Manchester City's reaction to the situation. They obviously, as a club, have the famous kind of "we're not really here" saying and song. And they adapted that beautifully into a range of products, which actually carried quite a lot more significance and poignancy because of the situation, which was great. But you also saw them adapting to things like cookery books and colouring books. So let's call it kind of lockdown leisure products, which, again, things you could turn around relatively quickly, don't require long lead times, but showed great fleet of foot to do things. And I think that's... that was evident across certainly a lot of football clubs and a lot of other sports as well. And on the business side, of course, beyond the kind of creativity, you saw a lot more kind of collaboration and cooperation. First and foremost in licensing, again, between, say, rights holders and their partners, their stakeholders, licensees and retailers. Obviously, a lot of existing agreements had to be addressed, payment schedules, that sort of thing. And what I hear across the industry is that practically everyone was open to being lenient and flexible and postponing things, which makes absolute sense for all. And it kind of re-emphasizes the fact that it is a stakeholder business, and that everyone is part of one supply chain ultimately. So you have to work together in order to deliver. So that was good to see. I suppose the other massive impact was e-commerce, where obviously it was a more than a growing trend already. But everything kind of shifted to that, and in particular when you listen to some of the stories from the sports e-commerce companies, they're some of the ones that have been doing the best, or rather those with sports-based product, because there was no ability to go to the stadium or even to a city centre shop or a mega store. That's exactly where everything was delivered, and that channel became and continues to become even more important. And then I guess if we think about some of the major events and how they adapted, most were cancelled. The likes of UEFA with Euro 2020 very quickly stepped up and allowed their licensees, the opportunity to sell product next year that still has 2020 on it. Very careful and sensible. Otherwise, a lot of companies would have got out of business. I think the same with a couple of others. The Open Championship, who very smartly a few years ago changed to not, as it were, not dating each year's, but numbering it. So the 149th that was due to be played at Royal St George's this year will be played next year. and that still allows the 150th to be back at the home of Golf St Andrews in 2022. So that's all worked out very well for them. And then, of course, probably the best example of pre-preparedness was Wimbledon and their incredible insurance, which you just have to tip your hat, really, because I'm pretty sure that wasn't done too long ago as an additional protection mode, but by the management there. And of course, probably will never be done again because no one will be able to afford the premiums. But an incredible bit of brand protection, and something which they should be very proud. And in terms of other events, again, one very close to my heart, the Rugby, the Six Nations, obviously was truncated, got halfway through, and then had to be stopped. And so, the constituent, unions and authorities within that sport very quickly and smartly moved to create another tournament with another broadcaster, obviously with some revenue to mitigate the losses. And we've just seen that, culminate in an extra time finish yesterday afternoon, which was quite extraordinary in its own right. So a lot of things, a lot of adaptations, a lot of smart moves by federations, in the face of some crippling losses and as everyone keeps referring to them, unprecedented circumstances. So I think we've seen some some class acts.
Yeah. And Julius,
I was just going to say, I think from a legal point of view, just responding to Simon's comments, I think the two biggest things that we saw, actually, Simon's reflected on. One is continuing growth and importance of e-commerce, and we'll talk about that a little bit later from a legal point of view, and how that impacts on, certainly from my point of view, the IP side and what you need to be doing. And then the other one was, well, really the contracts in this very difficult year. We saw a lot of licensing contracts, some arguments over things like force majeure clauses because of COVID, and I think you made the point, Simon, that it's a stakeholder business, and so people being cooperative, that definitely seemed to be generally the position. But of course, there are still some disputes over who owes who what in these difficult sort of circumstances, and they were definitely seeing quite a bit of that. I think the best treatment was very much to think, well, this is a long-term rather than a short-term business, and the relationship is more important than the immediate term or the immediate amount of money. But that's definitely something that we were seeing this year.
Absolutely. And there's been some creative ways of accessing new consumers in new and emerging markets. So we've talked about a couple of international competitions there. Julius, are there any special considerations when looking at the control of international rights?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting area. When we're dealing with our own brands and the brands that we're involved with, we kind of make the assumption that they're exceptionally well known. A lot of them are in sports; they're very well known, the brands, to the fans and in relation to the events. That's when expansion into new areas, new product areas, and new jurisdictions is particularly interesting, because we assume that we can exploit them in these other jurisdictions, and that we can exploit them in other product areas. And actually, from a straight legal point of view, that's the first thing we need to dispel, is actually the fact that isn't automatically the case. Just because we're well known in the UK or in Europe or in the US doesn't mean that we have the right to exploit that name or that brand in another jurisdiction. So the first thing we always say is, well, you need to do some due diligence and clearance around that when you're looking at those from a boring legal point of view, when you're looking at those exciting opportunities, just need to make sure that the I's and T's are dotted and crossed respectively around whether the rights can exist to be able to exploit them in those jurisdictions. See that problem all the time. We saw it, and Simon mentioned the Six Nations, the Guinness sponsorship, not being possible from a regulatory point of view in France. To show that brand, and having to come up with the creative solution around using greatness instead of Guinness for the on-pitch advertising. That's an example of a regulatory framework issue, but we see it all the time with rights as well. You're going into Asia, China, Middle East, certain jurisdictions where actually it's quite common for rights to be owned by third parties, and it to be quite difficult to get them back. The most extreme example of that I've seen, and not actually a sports example, but Apple, who most people have heard of, wanting to try and exploit their own iPad mark in China, and ended up spending around 60 million on recovering it from third parties, despite being very well known over it. So don't assume that the rights are there. Got to actually look at that. You then got different approaches in different jurisdictions, you know, law and regulation. You know, the US is very different from the Middle East, is very different from Asia in relation to the approach to both ownership of rights and sort of legal frameworks. And actually, again, you know, there will be differences that you need to take in terms of approach in both owning the rights and in relation to, you know, what you're going to need to do from a local regulation point of view to exploit. Also language issues, you know, that I mean, I'm an absolute heathen when it comes to these things from a language point of view. I speak English and speak it slightly louder in different jurisdictions, like traditional Brits. But language issues are huge in brands and in IP rights. Actually, how does this brand translate? Is it known by this brand, or is it known by a local translation or transliteration? What rights do I need to obtain, both from an IP framework point of view to be able to exploit it, but also actually to enable my brand to be communicated properly to local consumers? Does it work, my brand, in that jurisdiction? Or does it mean something inappropriate? Is it very difficult to pronounce? And these sorts of things. So do I need to shift my thinking from an IP point of view? So I think there are lots of different issues, cultural issues as well. You know, actually, does my existing licensing product framework work in Korea as well as it does in the UK? Actually, are there a different range of products that I need to be doing to really hit that market? That's more of a business point of view, more of Simon's area. But for us, that means actually, you know, can I exploit the rights in these jurisdictions? Have I searched? Can I protect them? Are there third parties that are in the way? Are there regulatory issues that would prevent me from exploiting the potential opportunity? Are there cultural and linguistic issues in different jurisdictions that will impact on how we go about doing that exploitation? And you know, do I need to have a slightly different business model because of those cultural differences? So there are quite a lot of different things. It shouldn't get in the way of the exciting exploitation part, as long as they're thought about reasonably far in advance and the boring I's and T's dotted and crossed accordingly.
Sticking in that exploitation of different product categories area, Simon, an area that we've seen grow this year quite substantially is e-commerce. Well, let's start with esports and gaming. One of the areas that has weathered the storm pretty well. What sort of opportunities have there been in the past, and do you see in the future for this area with regards to sports?
Yeah, I mean, esports is a juggernaut really at the moment, and I guess there's an age-old debate as to what is and what isn't sport in the esports world. There's a lot of gaming that's become esport, and it's hugely powerful. It's absolutely imitating and very successfully mimicking the arena of traditional sports as well, with hundreds of thousands of people you know, watching both live as was and online. And I think you see this coming through as well, and the whole kind of area of esports / you know, kind of virtual gaming becoming more and more important. And again, no more so than during the pandemic, when we saw sports, actually I guess mainly individual sports, where it's perhaps in some ways a little easier to do. A good example would be with Formula One, where they very quickly pivoted into esports to replace the regular event calendar. And although it wasn't absolutely, you know, everybody in its entirety, not all drivers took part. I think there were 11 or 12 drivers that took part, but they kind of added value to that by not only having them race against each other, but having other celebrities from other sports and other fields of celebrity joining in and racing against them, and you know, making it more exciting from that perspective. And listen, the proof in the pudding in that was absolutely the viewing numbers. They got, I think, 30 million plus viewing that series. I think that was record numbers. I think more than two-thirds of that was on digital platforms. So again, if we generalize, that's potentially a younger audience or a future audience as well being brought into the sport. So, you know, they turned that around in a very, very short space of time, which is very impressive. I guess by contrast, but still in a sort of individual sport, something that's actually been running for a number of years, the Virtual Grand National that appeared this year, and everyone thought, oh, it's the first time we've ever heard of a Virtual Grand National, but it's been running for a few years. Totally different audience, I'd imagine, and their adaptation was I think equally successful. I don't know about the numbers, but an animated version in effect which looked very, very real and very, very strong, and ultimately gave the sport an opportunity to give back as well. I think the bookies, everyone's favorite people in sport, the bookies actually gave all their profits to the NHS urgent COVID appeal. So that was a great piece of, let's say, sport and stakeholder PR from that section of the sport. But again, I'm talking about things just as it is in complete contrast. Something very, very different, as I say, already in existence, but brought to prominence by the pandemic. I think there are many sports that can benefit more from this in more traditional gaming sense. A lot of the team sports close to my heart, the likes of cricket, rugby, probably haven't managed to let's go back to that business collaboration and cooperation. They haven't managed to bring all the necessary and relevant rights together in one game. And ultimately, if you're a healthily cynical consumer and you look at a game and it doesn't contain all the exact rights that you expect in a World Cup or whatever the competition may be, then it doesn't look as authentic as perhaps it should be, and it's not the ultimate product that should be on the market. So I guess those kind of federations, where possible in those kind of sports, if they can collaborate and cooperate further into the future to bring together all the necessary IP, then actually the result is a much more valuable product on the shelf for consumers. So I know that that's easy to say. Hopefully I can play a part in helping some of those sports and federations in doing that, but I think that has to be the aim, where you've had very successful gaming out there for a long time. You can't really make a leap forward into full esports without sorting out rights issues first, which might be more in Julius's area as well. But I think there has been some dilution in that area for quite a while.
So Julius, just beyond rights clearance and ensuring that all of the IP that's relevant to these activities are cleared and are brought together, is there anything from a legal perspective that people need to be aware of when they're looking into these sorts of activities?
Well, it's an interesting area, and probably this last year, I think it's fair to say, isn't it, Simon, that the fact that normal live sport hasn't been happening has probably been a big opportunity to pick up audience, but it's also likely to be something that continues to grow, bearing in mind where the world is going. I think from a legal point of view, arguably, not arguably, esports are another sport from this point of view. So whilst it's another sector, so as you said, clearance on the right. If you're talking about esports, which are effectively an online version of live sports, so federations, etc., then if you're the people running those events, then yes, you need the right rights if you're going to be trying to make these things look official. I think the thing from a general IP point of view is the online world is much easier to replicate than the physical world. So it's much easier to do things wrong. It's much easier for third parties to do stuff that looks sort of semi-official without it's much more difficult to hire Wembley and put on an event than it is to do something in the online space, which means there's much more access to the bad actors, which means generally speaking, whilst the principles are pretty similar, you likely have to be more on your toes from a legal point of view around these sorts of esports issues than you do in relation to the physical ones, because ambush marketing around a physical event, yes, it's difficult to stop, but it's also pretty difficult to do without significant resource. Whereas in the online world, it's much easier to achieve something that can potentially ambush or capitalize on the brand right. So there's that aspect. I think the interesting thing is it creates issues around the environment that's created within, the online events. And we're seeing that increasingly, that actually the possibility of exploitation of rights within the events, not just being the parties that are, the teams or the federations, but actually brands sitting within those online spaces. That's a very new area. So even agencies now designed to market or place brands within games, not just sports games, but actually, general computer games, and a huge new area of exploitation there, but also from a legal point of view, again, very easy for the games manufacturers, etc., to, you know, position your competitor in the online version of the game, whereas you're the main sponsor or the licensor in the context of the physical one. Again, from a rights point of view, it's not necessarily that you need different rights, but you need to be really on your toes in relation to those issues. And then probably the other big thing is where you're talking about potentially very different audiences for some of the esports. I mean, if you're talking about straight online versions of the events, Simon mentioned the Grand National, perhaps a different audience on the virtual one than the real one. I mean, I'm sure that's true. You've got very different audience, and you've got the concept of the tone of the sort of gaming community there as well. So not just esports in terms of online versions of events, but also true esports in relation to gaming as well. Real opportunities for brand exploitation, but to a potentially very different market, a different set of consumers than your normal licensing or brand exploitation activities. And in those situations, we also have to really bear in mind how, as a lawyer, when we're looking to get rid of certain activity, actually how people look at that behavior. So increasingly we're seeing in the legal world, brands caring a lot about how they come across from an enforcement point of view. And so not just do we have the rights and can we quash that thing because it's impacting on our bottom line, but actually how does that come across to the consumer? Huge issue in sport. I'm sure you'd agree, Simon. You know, the clubs making lots of money out of selling shirts at high prices. You know, the issue of getting rid of the counterfeits is something which carries with it some PR issues as well as straight commercial ones. And I think that's even more the case in the online space around gaming and esports, because it's a real culture and community there in relation to the customers, and being an aggressive large corporate does not go down that well in that environment. So it's not just straight legal issues. There are some interesting ones that are raised by the new environments and the virtual environments. Need to have the rights, need to think about, probably more enforcement than you might do otherwise because of the potentially increased range of activity, but balancing that with your tone online so you're not undermining what you're doing with your brand, whilst not strictly a legal issue, becomes a big consideration when it comes to how brands decide to not just exploit but then enforce their rights.
And sticking in that digital space, e-commerce and social commerce have been becoming bigger and bigger arms of the retail operations of many brands. Again, beyond what you've just said about the PR issues that come into the digital space, is there anything that you can see changing within the e-commerce space, how retailers are approaching it and how it might be approached from a legislative point of view?
Well, we've seen obviously this year, as Simon mentioned in opening, that e-commerce has become even more important. I mean, it was very much the direction of travel in any case, people selling online. I think what we've seen in the legal space is, I mean, the comment I've made earlier a couple of times is, well, it's just easier for third parties to have access to the market. It's easier to create a counterfeit or infringing product. Historically, I'm old, so historically, that would have been, I need to get to a market somewhere and sell these products, or I need to camp outside a stadium and try and sell this, this fake scarf, whatever it is. Whereas now you've got ready-made, everything that you need to effectively design, manufacture, ship, and sell an infringing product is available without you leaving your home. And so all of that, so whether that's manufacture in different places, design, drop shipping, but particularly the online marketplaces and social media, you basically have access to the same consumer that the sports brands have, and you have it with very little effort. So I mean that makes the problem much more significant. Being a lawyer and being negative about it, but it does. I mean, it creates so much more of an issue. We all know about eBay and Amazon, these sorts of things, but actually now there are over 1,000 online marketplaces around the world, selling these sorts of products. It's quite difficult to get your head around. Over 350 different social media channels. And so just the volume is the issue. So the starting point is just being able to see, right, where are our big problems? Do we know? Most brands out there, if they say to you, well, we don't really have a counterfeit or infringement problem, it either means that no one's heard of their brands or they haven't looked. And in general, there are big issues out there. And that's the starting point. From a law point of view, most of the law is there in terms of ownership of rights and infringement and court. The difficulty is the volume and the difficulty of the anonymity of the web. We see that a lot around social media and comments about individuals and people. It's the same in this commercial world. Actually, the difficulty is, well, I don't really know who's behind a marketplace listing or a social media post. So for regulation change, I'm sure some will come, but the most important thing actually is being able to monitor and investigate what's going on from a brand owner point of view, to be able to see what the issues are. Generally, the law relating to these things is there. So there's been developments over the last 10 years to create ways of tackling online infringement. So most marketplaces have been forced to come up with a way of taking down infringing products. So, there are lots of cases, probably 15 years ago, 10 years ago, around eBay and selling infringing products. And that forced them to create a thing called the Vero policy, which is an admin takedown procedure. So rather than having to go to court, you can just complain to eBay and have a listing taken down. So those sorts of things now happen across most of the marketplaces. It's not difficult to get rid of something as long as you have the right trademark rights. It's just very time consuming when there's thousands and thousands of them. It also doesn't stop the problem. It just removes the listing. So you tend to find those things pop up again, in a different country or again on the same marketplace again. There has been some regulation change. So countries like the US have got specific regulation and law around selling online and have punitive damages in relation to these types of activities. Very few countries have that. And that may well change, but unlikely within the next 5 years, if that makes sense. But that is starting to happen. And I think the huge benefit of that from a US point of view is because online sale is also generally at the moment channeled through a few big online payment providers like PayPal. Actually, that type of enforcement can work quite well because in the US, they can freeze PayPal accounts for the infringing parties and actually pay damages out of frozen PayPal accounts. It starts to become viable for brand owners. What else has been happening? I think the other trend is very much towards, obviously everyone is using social media more and more. Certainly my kids are. I try to avoid it personally, but that's because I'm looking how I do. I'm not made for social media. But what's happening more on social media is not just promotion, but also increasingly sale of product. And so that's pushed by things like WeChat in China, where really isn't social media. It's a combination of social media, Facebook, marketplace, all in one app. But increasingly other social media, Facebook is one of them, starting to create their own marketplaces or at least be able to sell direct through those channels. And that's, of course, even more difficult to deal with because it's so fast. And that's often the problem. So it's a huge issue. It's one where it isn't that the law isn't there to deal with it. It's more that from a practical point of view, the volume and speed of it is very difficult to deal with. You can only deal with it as a brand owner properly by having the right rights, of course, and then having a good program of monitoring to at least see what's going on so that you can decide what to prioritize. You won't be able to deal with everything, but the really big issues, getting under the skin of them and understanding where that product's coming from and being able to stop that is a very key issue. I think probably we'll also see more of a focus on official channels. I don't know what you think about that, Simon, but increasingly, if you go on these marketplaces, one of the things that's very difficult is, well, I can't really tell, what's an official product and what's not an official product. And I think because of the direction, one of the things that will happen is not necessarily a legal change, but brand owners thinking more about how they can differentiate on those marketplaces themselves to make it more obvious for the consumer that they're buying the right thing. And that could be official stores, so proper shop fronts online, shop fronts on the different marketplaces, rather than just authorized resellers. And that can be real help from our point of view in making the consumer understand, when they are buying a real product as against not. And then probably the other thing, which is more of a technical point, is perhaps an increase in use of brand GTLD. So GTLDs are a domain, so .com's a GTLD, and a few years ago, ICANN introduced brands being able to buy their own GTLD. So it could be a .UEFA, and actually that sort of thing help, because that can be controlled as a channel, is the sort of thing that can really could really help brand owners, because there would be no way of accessing that domain space if you weren't an official or an authorized partner. So I actually think from a legal point of view, some of the things that will help control this, that isn't necessarily regulation change, it's more behavior change from a brand owner point of view to help educate the consumer online.
So tough to control, but Simon, a lot of opportunity.
Yeah, there are, but I think actually a lot of Julius's points are, kind of more pertinent than we might think as commercial people, because the back end of what is happening online is almost going to become more important than what's happening front end. You can't guarantee sales of a product, but you certainly are giving it the best possible shop window there is. As Julius said, through marketplaces and there are an absolute plethora of places to sell online, but making sure that you are somehow policing your marketplace, looking after your rights, and protecting the equity and the value of your brand, I think is particularly important from a commercial context. When you have a conversation in the last 5 or 10 years, a conversation with any potential partner or licensee or retailer with regard to a brand is always going to include what you as the rights holder, or potentially as an agent for the rights holder, are doing to provide protection for the product categories in the area that they're going to trade in and spend a lot of time and money and effort developing product in. And it's not always that easy or that evident to do that. It can be obviously costly. It can be a drain on resources, and without just creating an advert for Julius's company, for Stobbs, you do need legal experts to guide you through this area, and probably do the things that you're not good at, which again goes back to the point of kind of cooperation and collaboration. When things look too good to be true, they probably are. So you need to look at how what appears to be an amazing opportunity and an explosive opportunity in potential sales in a particular retail channel, what the real nuts and bolts are behind that is a completely different matter. I mean, talking to retailers in certain areas in sport, and also licensees in certain areas in sport, some of the acceleration you've seen during the pandemic in online sales has been incredible. I mean, we're talking about a leap forward of 1, 2, 3, 4 years by what was forecast a year or two back. So that's extraordinary. But for all that acceleration and move to a new place, you've probably leapfrogged a whole bunch of potential legal issues that we actually didn't know existed. So again, I think going back to the legal roots of this as a channel and as a platform, you need to be very, very careful. And I think what's happened is, in sport, like life in general, I look at sport as a kind of lifestyle choice. And if we look at the delivery of sport through TV, everything has been segmented very, very quickly in the broadcast world. Everything is now about choice and about having options. And that's how it's really gone in sports licensing and the retail side as well. But with all those choices and options come different levels of potential slip up, if you like, and you maybe sit as a brand owner or a brand manager of some sports rights and thinks, God, we should be selling on TikTok, Facebook, Instagram, every single platform going, the new platforms coming through like Firework, and the ones we don't yet know about. But actually, it's not just like supplying to a bricks and mortar retail. There are other considerations, jurisdictional ones, territorial ones, and understanding exactly what you should and shouldn't do from a consumer point of view, not risking getting into ad apathy very, very quickly by just bombarding your fans and your consumers with mini product ads in every single form of social media that it's out there. So it's a learning curve, I think, and like many things through the course of this year, it's a learning curve that's very steep. But I genuinely, go back to that core point of using expertise outside of your core area of expertise. And commercial is one thing, is often seen as the kind of front end and the business developer, and Julius will agree with me in a light-hearted way that the legal side might be seen as the kind of business prevention, but it's even more important when things are moving really, really quickly to have those two areas dovetail with each other, and as far as possible, to work together from the start of a new initiative. And e-commerce and the online space in general, whether we're talking about transactional or we're talking about gaming, is definitely one of those areas. And I think it's I was very lucky in my time with one of the big sports agencies, IMG, to have an amazing legal department. And I made it a policy to, let's say, focus on what I knew and ensure that I had a great legal representation from the off in meetings with new clients or with new potential big partners, because issues and hurdles would always come up. And I'd like to think that's the way I would do business now as well, and use associates in the sports industry to focus on what they know, and I'll focus on what I know.
I think the learning is a really important point. You made that point, Simon. The learning. I mean, everything's moving very fast and changing very fast, so we can't just stick to what we were doing before.
Sure.
Moving, a team takes a new player in a jurisdiction, suddenly you've got a massive following in that jurisdiction. Suddenly there are people willing to provide product to those people, even if it isn't you. We have some things where we'll be doing an enforcement program worldwide for a brand, and they'll be like, well, why on earth are we doing 750 takedowns a month in the Philippines? We didn't think we had any following in the Philippines. Well, there's people selling a lot of product there, and actually it can be a circular thing. Actually, we say, well, that's really interesting and useful information. We should be trying to fill that gap ourselves. So that's where actually the distinction on this space, the distinction between the legal and the commercial, is much less stark, I think, than in.
Absolutely, yeah. You don't worry, Julius. I believe that legal firms are business developers as well as.
But still, the department no, but they're less so in the online space.
I think so.
Something Julius mentioned a little while ago was the differentiation of your authentic product from counterfeits. But you also, of course, have to differentiate from competitive products. And with retail moving faster and faster, Simon, what sort of role do you think the provision of assets and style guides plays in differentiating your offer?
A critical role, Rhys, to be honest. We're probably way past when a traditional style guide was of use to all partners and licensees, and we're in a situation even more so now where retail is moving so quickly that you need to either work collaboratively and cooperatively directly with that retailer, or you need to be developing or uncovering IP assets and content that actually potentially is owned by the rights holder already, but has never yet been unearthed and used. And by that I mean, let's look at some real examples. During the pandemic, very quickly you saw FIFA utilizing a lot of their archive content to engage fans, retain fans, and kind of reward them for the lack of live sport. You see it even very, very recently, I think, in the press in the last couple of days. Red Bull, I think it is, with Trent Alexander-Arnold, have created a little animation short, which is just a kind of return of fans to live sport. But that's the sort of content that sometimes you can grab and you can translate into a design that can become a licensed product in the kind of quick response, viral marketing, live mode that everyone is dealing in as well these days. So what I mean by that is there's probably content locked up somewhere within an organization that you can bring to life, realize and commercialize and monetize. But then there's also, on a daily basis, there may be new content becoming available either by design, like the example I gave with Red Bull, or by incident, an accident even. When a live event is on, this kind of quick response product that a lot of the online companies now offer, where you're literally capturing a moment in time or a saying or a phrase or a score line, whatever it may be, and translating that into product. We're going to see an awful lot more of that. Some of the US corporations do it amazingly well around US sport, and it's a bona fide channel of delivery and a category in its own right. I think we'll see lots and lots of that. All that said, the other thing I think, and it's a hackneyed old phrase of mine, but retro never goes out of fashion. A lot of brands have been using retro content for years and years, and again in times of austerity, and we've had beyond austerity this year, lots of consumers and fans in the sports world as well will revert back to the good old days, or some retro content. I think a little bit convoluted, but an amazing example of how athlete and player generated content turned into merchandise was with The Last Dance, an incredible series by Netflix, but coupled with that online you had a whole raft of different licensed products out there harping back to the amazing days of the Bulls and what they achieved, Mr. Jordan. And I think, again, you'll see more and more of that. I think if you look to what marketers are thinking of and keen on going forward, we're going to see a lot more athlete generated content. The stories of athletes, sport is all about storytelling. You're going to see a lot more of that kind of content coming through. Even just after that, there was an article in the UK sports press. I think it was Northampton Saints, the rugby club, opening their doors to a film crew to come and film them for a season. We will see more and more of that. And what you have to expect to see is the associated product that comes alongside that. Is that traditional style guide and traditional asset? No. Is it moving with the times? Yes, it absolutely is. And that said, I think the other beauty of the sporting calendar is that we have every year, subject to pandemics, every year we have a set of annual events where retailers and licensees can delve into either the event itself or associated brands. So in the summertime, I was impressed to see Primark using the Prince brand in store around the fortnight of Wimbledon, which of course didn't happen, as we all know, but it was treated as a fashion brand, delivered in a style which was very non-tennis but very fashion and lifestyle, and it had relevance despite there not being a tournament or championships, sorry to be precise. There wasn't there was a relevance to it, and I happen to know it's something that was planned 12 or 18 months in advance, but because it's planned around a sporting calendar, it has a relevance and a resonance. And I think those are the sort of things as well. If you forward plan now and think, well, what happens if there's another pandemic in 21 or 22? Sorry to be a doomsayer, but if there's unpredictability about the future, how do you plan for product that's relevant? If it's not related to an event, what can it be related to? Something else in that sport that is intrinsically or inherently linked to it. So I think it's, again, I go back to the sort of similar point right from the start. It's about creativity and adaptability. Need to think of other ways to generate assets. And again, I think a lot of sports federations probably have a lot more assets under the bonnet than they think or they know, or they've been able to spend time clearing. And again, in collaboration with our friends in the legal department, those things can be cleared, utilized, and very importantly, monetized.
Julius, so with digging into these older assets or creating new assets, are there any pitfalls that people should be aware of?
Yeah, and I think Simon raises quite an interesting comment about the range of content as well. We're not just talking about brand in Simon's examples, actually new content, film, etc. I think from a straight Department of No legal point of view, we're looking at the distinction between is something ownable or not. You know, do we own this, and therefore can we stop someone else using it or not? And I appreciate that's the straight legal assessment, not the commercial assessment. There'll be plenty of situations where actually that won't matter because we're selling a lot or it's done wonders for our brand in some way, etc. But from a legal point of view, that's what we're looking at. So historic assets, retro, you know, club badges or logos or these sorts of things, which you're seeing quite a lot of. Generally speaking, I mean, this should be okay. I mean, we should be able to have protection in relation to those types of assets. Just worth checking. There are a couple of things that get raised by that sort of historic issue that aren't raised by new ones. So actually, has that thing passed into the public domain somehow? Have we let rights go in relation to that 50-year-old thing? Or if we did have rights, have we used those rights or not? And if we haven't, does that mean that we have vulnerability in relation to those rights? There are definitely a few things to check. You know, if a club logo has been used widely by fan clubs or by parties that aren't related to an organization, you know, it doesn't have to be a club, but then it's going to be much more difficult for you to then reclaim ownership of that thing somehow and stop other people from using. When it comes to the additional, but it can be done. It just needs to be thought through. When it comes to additional content, of course, you know, if it's your content and you own it, fantastic. Exploitation from a legal point of view, brilliant. It's going to be very difficult for anyone else to kind of jump on the bandwagon of that. But what we also see is exploitation of things that are public domain or aren't ownable. And so, you know, the common things there are, you know, quotes. If we go, well, if we do a range of merchandise around I am the greatest, you know, for example, well, I kind of know who that is probably relating to, but it wouldn't likely be protectable. So in introducing that sort of product or range, it may be a stupid example, but actually what you're doing is creating something that's easy to copy, that actually would be very difficult to prevent. So, and that's usually what we're looking at from a legal point of view is, well, when you're deciding what you want to exploit, we're going to try and say no if you can't own and enforce on it. But even from a commercial point of view, straight commercial point of view, choosing things that allow you to be able to prevent third parties jumping on the coattails of what you're doing, which is really what our legal hats are trying to do, is sensible. So the check is, well, actually, is the asset I'm trying to exploit something that is ownable? Do I own it? And are there any issues around public domain or anything that might have undermined my rights if I did? Assuming those things are okay, then actually I agree with Simon that actually the reuse of some of those assets and the going back to sort of harking back to you know, the sort of retro look and feel is you know, can be very successful, and there's no reason why it can't be legally protectable as well.
And another way that brands are really exploring new audiences and new ways to reflect the values that they hold is through collaborations, Simon. What does this sort of activity really do for a brand?
Well, it's I guess it, you know, it keeps it top of mind and gives it great kudos. And then, as has been proven recently, it can massively increase its value. You know, I think again, recent announcement that Supreme, who are probably considered by many as the king of collaborations around the world, they seem to have collaborated with just about every other brand. You know, they're being bought by the VF Corporation for a mere $2.1 billion, and having also collaborated with a lot of the VF brands already. So they're kind of almost like bedfellows, and you know, they've continued to push up their value in the marketplace. I mean, it's they're not alone. There are a lot of collaborations going on in the sport world, sport even veering over into character as well. But I think the really interesting space is what happens in the current world with a lot of, let's say, causes, if that's the right terminology, and topics that are debated heavily, is where we go in the world of sports people as spokespeople, let's say. And I'll have read with interest, like many people, about the recent acquisitions of Jay-Z's Rock Nation, signing people like Sia Khaleesi, the South African rugby captain, after the Rugby World Cup, and Marcus Rashford, obviously, and everyone knows what he's done in this country recently with school meals and food banks and that area. And then most recently, I think Maro Itoje also signed with Rock Nation. These are all big, significant figures in their sports. But I'm most interested to see what comes out of that in a kind of licensing context. If I bring it back to that, I see them being much more likely to be involved in cause-based collaborations than product and brand-based collaborations. But if there is a cause-based collaboration, then that could still warrant, product as a result, and product being, a support mechanism in terms of a statement by an individual, as well as obviously potentially a contribution. So if Maro is tied up with, or Sia Khaleesi, let's say, is probably a better example, is tied up with certain charities in the townships of South Africa, then by buying something, if you're contributing to aid or funds that go towards helping the issues in those townships, then it brings a different kind of emotive response from consumers. So I think very interesting times to see those kind of figures highlighted for partly, I guess, their sports celebrity, but much more about what their views are. Obviously, I'm dodging the obvious obvious topic of their views on racism and living with that, growing up with that, working with that in their sports. But actually, what other different causes could they be linked to, and could there be product realizations out of that as well? I think there could be, but it needs to be done in a sensitive way. And if it's done, it could be done in a way that's generates useful funds for the different causes that they're associated to. So yeah, I mean, collaborations have been fairly non-stop for the last few years between brands, and sports no different. But I think we need to be also concentrating more on how collaborations can do good for wider and more important issues.
Absolutely. And Julius, when you bring together multiple IPs, what are the sort of pitfalls that we need to avoid?
Well, I think from a straight IP point of view, we're usually talking about brand assets, so trademark protection in relation to key brand assets. And the joining together of them does create some legal issues. Not in the kind of ambassador situation that Simon was envisaging with Rock Nation, but where you've got brands formally collaborating, Supreme and Adidas, or then as trademarks, as a legal right, are there to designate or indicate one unique origin. Where you've got marks coming together and there are two different parties involved in the same collaboration, it can undermine the nature of the rights. So the simple legal point is merging the two is a real problem. If the consumer looks at it and goes, this is some form of new collaborative brand, is it Adidas or is it Supreme? Then that can undermine the nature of the legal rights that allow you to prevent someone else from using. If the collaboration is clear, this is two brands coming together to work together, and so those assets are distinct but collaborating, then you tend not to have any legal issues, around that space, and that's pretty much the simple issue around it. So you tend to look at where those parties are coming together and they want to create a new brand. You want to create a totally separate brand, a new brand that is a collaboration between two parties. But it shouldn't involve the existing brands, if that makes sense. Where you just want to indicate a collaboration, keep the two brands distinct and make it clear to the consumer they're working together. And that avoids really any of the legal issues, if that makes sense.
I think we're coming close on time, but is there anything that you can see looking forward
I guess first to you, Simon, in 2021 that we should be looking forward to sports brands exploring in this area?
Yeah, and listen, I think there's a couple specifically relating to the licensing, merchandising, retail side of sports, which is, as we've touched on many times already, e-commerce is going to continue to, dominate, not only be important, but certainly dominate, dependent on how many events can actually get up and running. That becomes the key channel of engagement between fans and sports brands. So definitely e-commerce, continued growth, and hopefully more creativity in that as well. And then again, one I've touched on a little bit, kind of sustainability as well is, again, a hot topic at the moment, but we've seen major sports and mainly football clubs launch sustainable shirts, but I think everyone needs to go a lot further than that and pretty quickly. Maybe if you're an annual event, you don't necessarily have the cycle to go around quickly and develop a whole sustainability policy and a whole range of product. But if you're a quadrennial event, you really should be looking to your next iteration and saying, by then we should be having sustainable product as merchandise, even if it's some of it. Again, going back to the point about consumer choice, so many of the population and in particular the younger generation, millennials, Gen Z, are going to be focused on that kind of issue going forward. If you don't have an offering in a sustainable context, then you'll just be ignored by them. So definitely those two, e-commerce and sustainability.
And Julius, any closing thoughts from you?
Yeah, I think e-com from a legal point of view, that's not going away. It's more and more of an issue from a legal point of view. So watch out, make sure you're watching, make sure you're monitoring so you can see what's going on. And, be prepared to adapt to that. Look out for online scams as well. That's increasingly growing thing around brands, using the reputation of a brand to get to consumers, to obtain financial information, even not just about counterfeit or infringing products. So I think that's that on the one side. And then probably, finally, everyone knows China is from a legal and IP point of view, a very important jurisdiction. If you're a brand who has any interest outside of the UK and any interest in products, make sure you've got your rights bolted down in China.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, all it leaves then is for me to say thank you very much, Julius and Simon. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. And thank you to everyone for watching. Goodbye.
Thanks very much.
Bye.